given at a conference to build the African Socialist International that was held in London, England in 2005. And it was a presentation that was delivered essentially from notes and was transcribed to go into various publications that we initiated from the African People's Socialist Party, the African Socialist International. And this is one of the transcriptions that came from, that went into the book, One Africa, One Nation. I wanted to say that it's important to understand this because sometimes when we have a presentation made in this fashion, then it goes through a process of copy editing and proofreading. And much of what you have before you now is dependent upon how accurate the transcription was and how accurate, how well the person who did the copy editing understood some of the information that was being put forward. And there are a couple of places in here that I've noticed have some slight errors, but they do not impact on the content or the significance, and I will point them out to you as we move forward. Those of you who've been participating in the studies with us for a while will recognize that we've been talking about this issue of identity in the nation for several weeks now, over even longer period of time. And the reason for this is because this question of who we are as a people is one that confounds Black people all over the world, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. It has serious implications for us, how we understand this question. If we, in the United States, for example, accept the definition of Africans as being some kind of hyphenated American, Afro-American, African-American, etc., we unite with our situation in general, just recognizing or assuming that we need some things to do some things to make it better so that the hyphen becomes less pronounced. And we become less hyphenated Americans and more real Americans. We are known in some places as Black Brits. We are known in some places and recognize ourselves as Afro-Swedes or Afro-Germans and things like this. And the point is, what has happened is that our oppressors have succeeded in erasing a fundamental component of our identity. And that is what we might call a national identity. Because if we don't have that, what we continue to do is to find ourselves in situations like in the United States, for example, of being unable to explain what's happening to us when the police are killing us on a regular basis. We come up and find ourselves accepting solutions like, well, the police, we just need to have police wear body cameras so that we can see what they do, or that the police need better training, or the police need to be able to accept that Black people are Americans too. This kind of logic impacts how we understand the world and how we explain our relationship to the world and to our situation. We find ourselves on the continent of Africa, where we find us confronted with ethnic divisions, where this group of Black people, because we are identified as this ethnic group, find ourselves in some kind of hostile and constant contradiction with this other group of African people who from some other ethnic group. or this region in Africa versus that region in Africa. Or we find ourselves being able to see our brothers and sisters and not even recognize they are our brothers and sisters in the face of all the outward evidence, finding ourselves rejecting that and assuming that because they speak French and are called Haitians, they are different from those of us who speak English and call ourselves Americans. When the truth of the matter, of course, is that they speak French for the same reason those of us who speak English, and that is that the white oppressors who controlled our lives were English and French speaking and imposed English and French on us at the expense of our own language and our own identity. It's a critical question because if we don't understand this question properly, and we find ourselves accepting again the definitions of who we are that's imposed on us from some external factor, force that's responsible for our overall condition. Today, we're living at a real critical time in history where people who are becoming clearer and clearer of who they are, what their relationship is to white power, are fighting to secure their own future and the future of their children. They are in places like Afghanistan. They are in places like Palestine. They are in places, Venezuela and all over the Americas, etc. And what we see is that somebody who is facing colonial oppression is in Afghanistan is treated more or less the same as African people are treated in the United States. Or somebody who is facing colonial oppression and occupation in Palestine is treated more or less by the white people there as African people are treated in the United States or in England or some other place like that. So that there is something that's common to the conditions of people who live in Afghanistan, people who live in Palestine, and to Africans who live in the United States or who live in Sweden or who live in Germany or something to that effect. And that it is critically significant for us to come to understand this question. Increasingly, what we see is that peoples all over the world are fighting back against United States imperialism, against white power, against Western imperialism. And these people are often considered terrorists. They're characterized as terrorists. They are fighting back to change their relationship. And in the process of doing that, they are seriously changing the world, and they are changing the expectations and aspirations and worldview of white people as a whole. And African people find ourselves fighting a furious battle on so many different fronts without being conscious of the fact that our struggles on all these different fronts are connected to each other. There are few places in the world where you can go. And if there are Arabs from Palestine who have their shops in our communities, there are few places where you cannot find that Arab from Palestine soliciting and getting some kind of support for the struggle that is happening with the Palestinian people against the white nationalist European-imposed settler regime of Israel. And many of these Palestinians have never seen Palestine. Many of them have lived in concentration camps called refugee centers all of their lives, because that's where they have been pushed subsequent to the creation of this entity that's now called Israel, pushed out of their lands, out of their countries. And yet they remain loyal to Palestine. That they are more than anything else, whether you find them in a shopping center in St. Petersburg, Florida, or Houston, Texas, or whether you find them someplace in Birmingham, in England, any other place. They are loyal to Palestine. But what has happened to the Africans is that the relationship that we have to Africa has been almost obliterated, so that we have now, we live in the situation where we are treated like Africans, but consider ourselves Americans, or consider ourselves Brits, or consider ourselves Swedes, or something like that. And of course, what that means is that our ability to struggle and to win our freedom is diminished seriously by that fact. This presentation was made in 2005 that we're going to be using as our study. Again, this was in London, England, and it was a conference that was attended by Africans from various parts of the world. And I think that's important to understand, because it was not a discussion that was directed just as Africans who live in the United States. It's a common contradiction that we have to resolve, this question of our national identity. And so I just want to go ahead and begin going into the document, the study itself. And as I said, there was a presentation that was made in the process of consolidating, building the African Socialist International, the African People's Socialist Party, the International African People's Socialist Party, and something that recognizes that we are one people, that is the ASI, the African Socialist International. And the African Socialist International is the organization that gives meaning to our recognition that we are one people with the intention of overturning the relationship that we have with imperialism and with white power. So everyone should have the text, and I'm going to start reading now. The question of the nation is important. It shouldn't take much for us as African people to understand the significance of this question, seeing what is happening to our Africa. In the 19th century, we saw the ridiculous carving up of Africa. Now we are told that all these little creations of imperialism created to facilitate imperialist extraction are separate and distinct nations. We are told that those of us who have been dispersed around the world and are not a part of the same group anymore in any meaningful way. We are told that those of us who have been dispersed around the world are not part of the same group anymore in any significant way. And I'm reminded years ago, when we were working with the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, we created in the party, the African People's Socialist Party in the United States, we created the first Zimbabwe African National Union Solidarity Committee, or Support Committee in this country. And one of the persons who, the key person at that time from ZANU was a comrade whose name was Topson Muere. And he talked about how he had gone to school and been taught by the white missionaries. And the missionaries had told him that once upon a time, there were African people in the United States, but over a period of time, we sort of disappeared, and there were no longer Africans here. So when he first came to the United States as a refugee from what was then called Rhodesia, he was shocked when he got off an airplane. He saw all these black people. So he knew from what the missionaries had told him that there were no longer Africans in the United States. So he thought that everybody he saw must have been Shona, like himself. So he started speaking Shona to them. And of course, the Africans didn't know what the hell he was talking about because the division and captivity of African people in dispersal had removed us from any association with our languages and our indigenous languages. But the point is that we were no longer Africans based on what he had been taught in a missionary school. Well, all of us have been going to missionary schools, wherever we're located, and whether we're called missionaries or not, but someone else has had control of our education and taught us who we are. So they told us that we're no longer part of the same group anymore in any meaningful way. You've heard all of the silliness. Everybody involved in this discussion has heard some explanation of why we are not Africans in this country. And so we say that we are now supposedly some aspect of a European created nation. In the United States, after they have finished calling us spooks and monkeys and niggers and Negroes, we've graduated to African Americans or Afro Americans or Black Brits. Our identity is not our own. It is in relationship to something that's been created by imperialism, white power. We have come to believe that Nigeria, for example, is a nation. This is illogical for any number of reasons. It is illogical because all you have to do is see that there is a relationship between people who live inside, excuse me, this nation, as they characterize the borders that have been imposed on us, and people who live in the surrounding so-called nations, but who look just like us. We know that if we are called African Americans, it means our national identity is somehow associated with America and not with our people. We know that everywhere we are, African people still experience a response to what we see happening to people who look just like us in some other place in the world, even if it's shame. And this is something that every African in the world has experienced. When we see something happening to Black people anywhere, whether it's massacres in Rwanda, whether it is murder in Jonestown, Guyana, whether it is hurricane in Louisiana, we all experience it. And we all experience it. Every African you know has an experience related to that reality. Sometimes our experience is one of shame. And whatever the shame is, the fact that we can be ashamed of something that somebody else Black is doing indicates that we feel a kinship or a relationship to that person. So the point is that again, we know that everywhere we are, African people still experience a response to what we see happening to people who look just like us in some other place in the world, even if it's shame. So many of us have been made to feel ashamed of Africa, both inside Africa and elsewhere. Nevertheless, we know that there is some kind of relationship here. So this question of identity is extremely important. Most of us have come to understand the question of nations based on our experience where we are located. Few of us have given much thought to the question beyond that, except that we see other Black people who look like us in other places. Therefore, our concept of a nation has been imposed on us by imperialism, by our relationship to white people, white power. White people have an ongoing historical struggle about what constitutes a nation. The Marxists discussed this, and much of what we say now in this section of the discussion really revolves around how white communists who consider themselves Marxists were involved in this discussion. And one of the reasons for that is because most of the discussions that people have been involved in who consider themselves progressives or revolutionaries around the question of the nation is something that came from the Marxist communist movement. Most of the definitions that are being bandied about, even if people are not necessarily familiar with the origin, they have been tainted by how the Marxists, and particularly Joseph Stalin, defined this question of nations. And the reason for that is most people haven't given much thought to what a nation is. They haven't thought about what it is that constitutes a nation. They've just accepted terms like nations and heard people talk about it and heard people say, we are one nation under God, invincible, and this kind of thing here in the United States. And most people don't know when somebody says country, they assume it means the same thing as nation. They assume a state is the same thing as nation. So most people haven't given it much thought. But we are talking about building a revolutionary party that has the responsibility of leading our people to freedom. And so what often appears to people as simply an abstract exercise, for us, this is a really important question, because it informs what kind of leadership that we're going to provide to people, our people who have to be free as one people all around the world. So we say that white people have an ongoing historical struggle about what constitutes a nation. The Marxists discussed this, and Joseph Stalin, from the former Soviet Union, put forth 5 criteria for what it is to be a nation. He was making a struggle for a scientific approach to define nation. And this question of science in society is really important because it's not something that ordinary folk, again, even think about. You know, it's like when you heat water on a stove to make tea or for any other purpose, nobody thinks about what is the science around what makes the water hot. You just know you put the stuff on and it gets hot. You put the water on and it gets hot. So there are a lot of issues and questions that are out there that people are accustomed to living with without even giving thought to what their origin is. But if you want to use this water to create a steam engine, if you want to do something other than simply make tea, if you want to do something other than make the water hot, if you want to be able to make a steam engine or do something else, then you need to know something about the science that facilitates this process of water heating, and you can understand other things that can be done with it. And that's how it is about society. And we need to understand something about society. We need to understand that there are laws governing even this question of nations, nationality, and other things that we can actually put our hands on. There are basic causes in society. And because what happens with us is we see our blackness in and of itself as being a factor that's determining our reality. For example, is melanin. Melanin gives us all of these magical, things and makes us think a certain way and act a certain way. And we forget that we probably had more damn melanin before we met white people than what we got now. If melanin didn't keep white people from doing what the hell is done to us up to now, then you can't talk about melanin, and you can't go to just some kind of religious solutions. There's a thing that, that Africans were Muslims when we were captured and brought here. So it's, Islam, if it was all that, then it wasn't all that to keep it from happening to us. Christianity didn't keep it from happening to us. So there's some science about society itself that we need to grapple with if we're going to get our way out of here. Well, we lost our culture because when we had our culture, well, hell, if we had all that culture when we met the white man and then they still enslaved us, how can you say that culture in and of itself is the solution? So the point is that there is a science of society. We cannot reject science. Science is really important to us, especially as African people who can barely feed ourselves because of the consequences, who've got so much to do in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of providing food, clothing, and shelter for ourselves, sciences that we had at one time when we met white people. This is the thing that attacked. The essence of the assault was to destroy the science that was necessary to produce and reproduce life. And culture is something that comes about. It is a consequence of the ongoing involvement of African people to produce and reproduce life. And melanin is important. It is important and as one of the things that help to define who we are, but it is not an explanation that should be found satisfactory to help to explain the conditions that we're in and how the hell we get out of it. So that's the question of science is really important to us, and the science of society is something that we want to have to deal with. So we say that this question arises in society not as some kind of abstract exercise, but because people are trying to solve problems. Even if the person's having the discussions are not fully aware of it, a problem has emerged in a particular society that has to be solved. The national question emerged inside Europe in part because Europe historically has been a place of warring tribes without a common identity as a group of people. At one juncture, what is now called Europe was known as Christendom. The concept of the European didn't even exist as something that was widely accepted until the 17th century. What was it then that created, in what we now refer to as Europe, among what we now call white people, a united consciousness that is now defined in terms of nationality, nationhood? Anybody who reads history will see how what we now call Europe was a territory made up essentially of warring tribes. We've heard about the Vandals, the Visigoths, and the Goths. These groups roamed around robbing and looting each other. That's common to the history of Europe. I think it's really important to understand this because Europe presents itself to the world as this civilized, stable force that's brought order to the rest of the world. The truth is that the history of Europe, what we now know as Europe, was this territory, this place where that was perceived to be north of Greece, where that was inhabited by these warring tribes, permanently and constantly robbing each other. In the Middle East, Europe was impoverished and diseased. Middle Ages, rather. In the Middle Ages, Europe was impoverished and diseased. It struck out to rescue itself by what has been called an era of exploration. You've been taught that in schools, that Europe went out to explore. In fact, it engaged in looting and robbing and the slave trade against Africa and other peoples around the world. At first, these groups of people from Europe fought against each other over who would get what loot. They were attempting to get around edicts that prevented one group or another from enslaving another people. You may be familiar that the Pope played a major role in deciding what area the two powerful countries at that time, Spain and Portugal, even though they used to be one country, Spain and Portugal was at one time one country. But the Pope gave a part of the world to Spain for enslaving people and another part to Portugal for enslaving people. And that's what I refer to when we talk about the edicts that prevented one group or another from enslaving another people. Different groups were trying to beat each other to the New World, where gold and silver and resources were looted. And I had New World, of course, is in quotes here. It was new to white people. It was in this process of looting the world, enslaving African people and slaughtering the indigenous people that Europe as a concept was consolidated. This was a unifying thing for Europe. And I think it's really important for us to understand this, because Europe, again, was essentially warring tribes, constantly fighting against each other. They were fighting poverty. In fact, if you look at some of the older definitions of economy that comes from Europe, they talk about it as a study of scarcity, because that is what Europe was, a place where scarcity really abounded. Everything was scarce except scarcity. And so that defined much of what was then Europe. Europe and the European, the white man, were created in this process of looting, robbing, and attacking the rest of us. That's the origin of the European. Before that, there was no generally recognized concept of Europe or Europeans. And one point I want to make is other peoples did exist. In antiquity, I mean, some of the places where Europeans are making war now, in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and places and other places around the world, they were ancient when white people first came into existence as a recognized united entity. So we said that that's the origin of the European. Before that, there was no generally recognized concept of Europe or Europeans. Europe came into existence in part as a result of this process that Karl Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital, the robbing and looting of other places to bring wealth, capital into Europe. Thus, the emergence of the European nation came into being as an attack on Africa and an assault on the consolidation of the African nationality. The emergence of the European nation came into being as an attack on Africa and an assault on the consolidation of the African nationality. The building of unity in Europe separated African people from each other. The process that brought white people together is the same process that took African people away from each other through the slave trade and by creating all of these artificial borders and other barriers that separate us. So the European nationality was consolidated as a part of the process to frustrate and destroy the consolidation of the African nationality. This is the dialectic with which we are working. I hope people understand this. I mean, there is a dialectical relationship here. The error that we find ourselves making too often is trying to escape from the process that we are trapped in by uniting with the process itself, by uniting with Europe, by uniting with white power, becoming a hyphenated white person, whether that's an Afro-Greek or Afro-Swede or Afro-American or something to that effect, when the fact is that the Swede, the American, and the rest of them have their existence as oppressors because of the attack on the consolidation of Africa and African people. So in the beginning, it was Europe that was poor and diseased. Africa was generally prosperous and healthy. Originally, it was Europe that was struggling to meet the capacity to produce and reproduce its life, to take care of itself. For anybody who might doubt that, I'd like to remind you that in just 4 years between 1347 and 1351, half the white people on earth died from the plague. They call it the Black Plague, even though we had nothing to do with it. The plague was serious. White people died, their dogs died, their cats died. It was terrifying. They thought God was wreaking vengeance on them. They had no idea what was killing them. The point is that you don't have a viable economy if a third to a half of your people die in 4 years. Over the next 50 or more years, there was an actual decline in the population of Europe. Europe was destitute and diseased. To rescue its, in fact, I read someplace a while ago that when Columbus set out in 1492, there were only about 70 million white people on Earth. That ain't that many people, you know. So we say that.
Share the broadcast.
How's that?
Oh,
okay. To rescue itself, Europe went out into the rest of the world and began this process of robbing and looting, stealing the wealth in all forms and bringing it into Europe. This process rescued Europe at the expense of the rights and resources of most of the other peoples on earth. We are told that the indigenous people who the white people came into contact with died because their immune systems were not prepared to deal with white people's germs. This is true, by the way. Most people don't recognize how devastating this contact with the European was. The weapons that made the European conquests in what is called the Americas possible was probably germs and disease. the indigenous population in the Americas died in ways similar to how white people died in Europe from the plague. Literally, an indigenous person would meet a white person who had just come from Europe. The indigenous person would then go back to his village or city, and damn near everybody in the city would die. This is the literal truth. This is the first part of the first contact. The consolidation of what we call the national identity of white people came at the expense of the development and consolidation of other peoples. This is how backwards Europe suddenly made a fantastic leap in terms of its own development. And I want to just, make a note here, because we're often told about how capitalism is responsible in this tremendous leap in productivity in human society among human beings. But the truth is that European contact and capitalism itself came about as a consequence of destroying the ability of other peoples to produce. I mean, if you read some of the diaries from the conquistadores when they first came to the Americas, and particularly what they now call as Mexico, how they saw stuff they had never seen before in their lives in terms of development, broad and wide streets, people living happily, just extraordinary. A whole city on the lake, on a man-made lake is part of what, and then they destroyed it all. I mean, where would people go? Where would people have gone? How would people have moved forward had it not been for the assault by Europe on them? And so now to talk about how capitalism resulted in all of this progress is to actually validate the significance, is actually to validate the European assault and genocide against the rest of humanity. You begin to accept history from the viewpoint of the oppressor, of the terrorist, so to speak.
Yeah.
Europe was poor and extraordinarily unfree, perhaps the most unfree place on earth. It was living under feudal rule. And next time we go to England, I want you to go, I think it's at the London Bridge, where they have this sort of museum of torture that the British have, this horror place where the British would actually torture people. It was an horribly, terribly unfree place. We were talking about Europe. People were burned to death for, being witches, and just a real horrible place to live. So it was living under feudal rule, but suddenly made an extraordinary leap in terms of development. Suddenly its consciousness as a people got consolidated in the process of getting rid of everyone else. Penny Hess from the African People's Solidarity Committee wrote a book called Overturning the Culture of Violence. Even though you can find a whole history of violence associated with Europe and European people, I believe in modern history, the consolidation of the European nation or nations took place in this process of extreme violence against the rest of us. The whole cultural expression of Europe and white people is one of violence. The whole cultural expression of Europe and white people is one of violence. There is an that might sound extreme, but it's not. And it's not just some prejudicial stuff that you want to throw at white people. When you say that the whole cultural expression of Europe and white people is violence, the only thing you're doing is identifying the fact that what we now know as the white man, Europe, came about in the world as a consequence of slavery and colonialism. You see, that's how it came into being. The whole cultural of what we now know as white people, Europe, it has achieved this expression through violence, through slavery, through colonialism, etc. This is the identity of white people as such. That's how it got consolidated. There is an understanding, and as subtle as it may be in North America, and I would suspect in Europe as well, that in order for some body to advance in society, somebody else has to suffer or pay a dear price for that. Success in this society always comes at the expense of someone else. The European consciousness was forged in a process of advancing all white people, not just the ruling class, but all white people. There was no such thing as a white ruling class until this attack on Africa and the trade in African human beings. This primitive accumulation of capital that Marx talked about didn't just elevate the white ruling class, it elevated regular white people who were tied to feudal oppression. It gave them an opportunity to put their labor power on the market for the first time and the ability to try to sell it to get the best value they could. Before then, they were essentially tied to serfdom under feudal tyranny. The emancipation of all the white people, not just the bourgeoisie, but the working class itself, was the result of the process of attacking the rest of us. That's why Marx would say that capitalism was progressive. In the development of what he called human society, because capitalism raised up all the white people, it raised up the workers and the bourgeoisie, both at the expense of the rights, resources, and well-being of the rest of us. The Europeans and the Marxists saw the world from their own vantage point. The Marxists believed that they were defining human society as a whole when they talked about development in Europe. Today, Europe is still involved in ongoing internecine struggles. The basis of these struggles, as quietly as it's kept, is competition over the resources that are being stolen from the colonial territories. They are fighting over who can get what. This struggle has, I imagine, intensified differences among white people, although I have never understood the great differences that white people see among themselves. I see language differences, that's obvious. But from my experience in traveling all over the world, white people generally have no profound cultural or other kinds of differences. In addition to language, they might have a different dance here and there, but I don't think that is significant. The Europeans have defined the world as it is today, and so this whole national question came to life because of contention between different groups and tribes of Europeans. Struggles emerged in the process of trying to solve these profound problems in European society that came about as a consequence of the emergence of capitalism. Even as it rescued white people from serfdom, capitalism was putting children in factories and forcing women to work in extremely bad conditions. Some of you who have a colonial education might remember the story Christmas Carol. And if you didn't have a colonial education, if you got a television or some other means, especially about this time, you saw Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It represents a struggle between sectors of the bourgeoisie in Europe and essentially in England. Dickens was a liberal who was trying to make the capitalists more humane in their treatment of working people. This is true. Dickens was a part of a community of white liberals who were trying to humanize capitalism. It is a story of the prototypical capitalist in the form of Ebenezer Scrooge. The story takes place at Christmas time. Dickens was struggling to make Europe a place of beneficence, where people could share and be nice and kind to each other. People were going around saying Merry Christmas, but Scrooge, the nasty capitalist, would always respond by saying, bah humbug. Scrooge was cruel to his employees. He was even cruel to Tiny Tim, the handicapped son of one of his employees, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge worked his employees like animals and wouldn't give them any time off, even on Christmas. He was just a nasty guy. The objective of the story was to win the capitalists to treat white workers better. So capitalists, you read this, oh boy, it was an expression from their perspective of the terrible thing that capitalism was doing to European society. The story was the vehicle for a struggle by certain bourgeois liberals in Europe to make capitalism behave more humanely to other white people. The problem with that, from our standpoint, was that even as the poor white workers in Europe were laboring under terrible conditions, Europe as a whole was benefiting from the 10 million people whom Leopold had just killed in the Congo. The struggle being made by Dickens was for capitalism to share more of its wealth, stolen from African and other peoples with white workers. You want to talk about handicapped children? Look at what King Leopold of Belgium did to Africans in Congo. Belgium was forcing African people to work in the rubber plantations to bring wealth to Belgium. When African people refused to work for Leopold, he slashed off their hands as punishment. There were mountains of hands, including the hands of little children. This was a way to attempt to force Africans to work in the rubber plantations. The Europeans didn't see what was happening in the Congo to make possible for a white person to have a job in England in the first place. And I want to say that, you know, this is a common struggle, because right now in America, Europe, everybody's fighting because capitalism treats the workers badly. They're talking about austerity, and the workers are not getting what they need. The students are losing their loans. The old people can't retire anymore, etc. And so there's a whole struggle by Europeans. You got this whole thing about we are the 99%, how the white people are 99%. But how then will Europe be able to give back the stuff that people are losing now? How do the students get their loans? How do the old white people get their retirement funds? They get them by taking more and more from Africans who are trying to live off $1 a day. The difference in their funds and their retirement and student loans is what they are not able to get with efficiency from colonized peoples around the world anymore. So as wonderful as people might say, oh, look at Greece. Oh, the Greece is so wonderful because the people are standing up and fighting for what? They're fighting to get back what they were having before the peoples around the world start taking back their resources. And that's something that needs to really be understood. So we say that terror against African people was what made it possible for white people to be more than a serf, more than a peasant tied to the land under feudalism. Dickens didn't see that. All he saw was what was happening to poor Tiny Tim and Bob Cratchit. Dickens didn't recognize that Scrooge couldn't exist except for the rape of Africa and the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the war that England was waging against China, the so-called Opium War, to turn China into a nation of junkies. None of that came into the European worldview. When Europeans talk about solving problems with the so-called national question, it wasn't just a discussion. It was an important philosophical task that was forced on society by its relationship in the world at that time. So they came up with a particular view that of what the nation was, a process that was also taken up by the socialist movement in Europe, in European societies. Movements emerged in European society to deal with what they saw as the contradictions of capitalism. It treated people so badly. Some Europeans wanted another kind of society. Some were utopian socialists who believed that all you had to do was convince the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, to be nicer. Dickens was represented here. Marx and Engels were scientific socialists or communists who understood that the bourgeoisie is not going to change because it is in their material interest to keep things as they are. This is what became known as Marxism-Leninism. Actually, it's just Marxism would have sufficed. The question of the nation and nationality emerged to try to forge together a cohesive group of people in European society who would fight to overturn capitalism as it was affecting the so-called industrial working class of proletariat. This is from the Marxist view. This is where the national question became so important, because what they found was that different workers from different countries found themselves uniting with their own bourgeoisie because they were all Swedes, or they were all Belgians, or they were all French. And and etc. And so they had to deal with this whole national question in order to emancipate the white worker from what might be false identity as nations. So the Marxists had to come up with a concept of a nation to unify the workers so they could overturn the bourgeoisie. The Marxists said that the bourgeoisie had no respect for borders, and they were right. They don't have any nationality as such, even though you are supposed to respect their borders and nationality. Patriotism is nothing but solidarity with the bourgeois state. That's why we say in the United States that a patriot is a white nationalist. You know that there are white nationalists, black white nationalists, and brown white nationalists. If you're a patriot in the US or Britain, you're a white nationalist, because patriotism is nothing but solidarity with the bourgeois oppressor state. The Marxists had to solve this problem of making a revolution that would result in the overthrow of capitalism. They saw the struggle as not just something local or peculiar to one European state. It would encompass all the European states, led by the workers from the most industrial European states in North America. The Marxists characterized Africans and other colonized people as uncivilized. However, Marx in some of his work nevertheless revealed that wage slavery, meaning capitalist jobs for white workers, rested on a pedestal of slavery pure and simple in the New World. So although Marx wrote this, he didn't really understand it. He said capitalism rests on the pedestal of slavery pure and simple in the New World, yet he came to the conclusion that the way to overturn capitalism is for white workers to wage a revolution against the capitalist ruling class. That's crazy, isn't it? I mean, if capitalism rested upon the pedestal of slavery pure and simple, you don't solve that problem by getting the white workers to overthrow the white ruling class, because the whole thing rests upon the pedestal of slavery and colonialism. If you really want to get rid of capitalism, then what do? Yes, you get rid of the pedestal, don't you? And what is the pedestal? It is slavery and colonialism. So anybody who's really interested in getting rid of capitalism, go to the black question, right? That's where you want to get rid of capitalism. So all that other stuff, you just jive. It is meaningless. It's accepting the whole white definition of reality, and what you end up doing is fighting for white power, because even if they are successful in overturning the bourgeoisie, if the white workers overturn the white bourgeoisie, African colonialism still exists. Mexican land still, under their possession. And all the other people are catching hell. The only thing they've done is transfer the title from one group of white people to another group of white people who live off the blood of Africans and other people. So we say that,
No.
say no? Oh. Although Marx wrote this, he didn't really understand it. He said capitalism rests on the pedestal of slavery pure and simple in the New World, yet he came to the conclusion that the way to overturn capitalism is for white workers to wage a revolution against the capitalist ruling class. That means he believed that the workers, a sector of the people who sit on top of the pedestal, would fight against the bourgeoisie and then take over. The pedestal is still there. That pedestal is made up of African people and others who are colonized and oppressed. I'm going to read the next line here. The date is wrong. The Marxists had serious debates about this. In it says 17, but it should read 07. During the Second International, this happened in Stuttgart, Germany. The idea came up of overturning colonialism. This was a debate that was the communists, the Communist International, Second Communist International. It happened in Stuttgart, Germany in 1907. The question came up about colonialism. This was a debate that they had to deal with. And the idea came up of overturning colonialism. Most of the white communists were saying, hell, we can't overturn colonialism when everything we get comes from extracting resources from the colonial territories. Some people even call for a socialist colonialism. They did that because they recognized the objective relationship between white wealth and the colonial and slave conditions of the rest of us. Let me tell you this. At that conference in Stuttgart, 1907, At the mass rallies that were associated with the conference, 60,000 people. You understand this? 60,000 white people from various places in Europe attended the mass rallies. More than 864 delegates from the communist movements from throughout the white world, and I think Japan may have been there, attended this conference where they now debating, the position was to oppose the colonialism. And the majority was saying you can't get rid of colonialism, because all of what we have, what we survive on comes from colonial territories. So they say what we can do is, we don't want a bad colonialism, we want a good colonialism. And our colonialism, we can have a socialist colonialism, but we're gonna keep the niggers and all these other people under our domination. That was a real debate that happened. And this is from the most advanced sector, but think about this, the most advanced sector of the white population were having this debate. So we say that the Marxists and Stalin in particular developed the 5 criteria for what they say constitutes a nation. They had to solve the problem unifying all the workers of the world. But their definition of the workers of the world did not include the people of Congo, for example, who were harvesting rubber for Leopold from the rubber plantations so that Firestone and other corporations could make tires. The Marxist definition of workers did not include the people who were bringing out elephant tusks and ivory coats so Europeans could make billiard balls and piano keys. Because we were forced to do that to facilitate European development, we are told that our nation is the Ivory Coast and we are Ivorians. The process that facilitated the creation of the national identity of white people is also one that is supposed to define for us what our nationality is. In some places we are elephant tusks, and in some places we are shrimp, as in Cameroon, where the Portuguese caught a lot of shrimp. Camaro is Portuguese for shrimp. So there we are, the shrimp nation. And in other places, we have all these other extraordinary names based on the resources that Europe stole from us. What were the 5 things that Stalin said made a nation? Stalin said a nation is a historically grown, stable community of language, territory, economic life, and a psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. This is what Stalin said a nation is. He said that if any of these things is missing, it isn't a nation. And all the communists everywhere united with that. The Marxists characterized themselves as being dialecticians. That means that they were supposed to see things in an all-sided way. To look at things dialectically means to see things not simply as they are, but to recognize that they are always in a process of coming into being and going out of existence. The world is in a permanent state of motion. That's what the Marxists say on the one hand. But on the other hand, Stalin is telling us that if any one of these conditions is missing, it can't be considered a nation. That's wrong for a number of reasons. The thing about science and scientific theory that is so important is that it has to have the ability to be falsified. If you can't falsify it, then it can't be scientific. Can't be scientific theory. For example, if somebody says God created the world, you can't falsify that. You can't prove it one way or the other. You can't come up with the evidence. You can believe that if you want to, but you can't call it scientific theory. But if you say that these things are necessary for the existence of a nation, you can falsify that. You can look for the qualities defined by nation, by Stalin. And if they are not present in what is clearly a nation, then you can prove that theory is wrong. Stalin's definition can give you a scientific approach, but his theory is wrong. The place that I start from in falsifying Stalin's definition of a nation is this understanding of how the European nationality was created at the expense of the African nation of nationality. Our conditions of poverty, oppression, and the powerlessness. And the fact that we have not consolidated ourselves as a nation is a precise consequence of the consolidation of the power, wealth, and nationality of our oppressor. That is scientific. I don't have to go beyond that to know that what Stalin said is wrong. It's like it's like defining a parasite and the host. And you say that the parasite is a real entity because it has certain characteristics of growth, certain dynamic features. But you say the host is not a real entity because it doesn't have the same features. But the host can have the same features because the parasite saps that, sucks that to create itself. It negates the ability of the host to be the dynamic force that it can be by its own existence in relationship to the host. So Stalin's definition cannot be true. Europe had a common economic life through destroying the common economic life of African people. There's no doubt that in Africa, if it were not for the intervention of white power, we would be speaking the same language, have the same common economy, and our nationality would be consolidated. It is illogical to assume otherwise. French is spoken in Cameroon because of the economic relationship with France. But it seems to me that I would be speaking kosher if I lived in Sudan because of the relationship I would have with what they call South Africa. We're all on the same continent. Yet I live in Cameroon, speak French, but don't speak Hosha that's spoken in South Africa. Or don't speak Lingala that's spoken in Congo. And that's because our economic connection is to France and not to other Africans. If I live on a continent where the resources that we need to exist are distributed all over the continent, and economic success as a people would require us to come together, logically, we would speak the same language. It is illogical that England, starving to death, would travel all the way to what we now call the Americas to get what it needs to survive. It is logical that people living on the same continent, we say if it is logical that England, starving to death, would travel all the way to what we now call the Americas to get what it needs to survive, it is logical that people living on the same continent without any intervention would be uniting in a single language and economy. Imperialism, there are more people who speak English who live outside of England than who lives in England itself. There are more French-speaking people who are outside of France than who live in France. There are more Spanish-speaking people who live outside of France than Spain than who live in Spain. And they speak these languages because of the colonial economic ties that were imposed on them by these external forces. That's why people like to refer to Spanish-speaking people as Hispanics, when, of course, that's not the case, because Hispanics were what? White. Yeah, they're from Spain. Imperialism frustrated and undermined the consolidation of the African nationality. The African population is a dispersed nation in the making. We are a dispersed nation. We are not different peoples. We are a dispersed nation. That is important for us. Our oppressor teaches us that many things divide us: ethnicity, religious differences, linguistic differences, and the silliness that affects us because I live in Jamaica and you live on the continent, or I live in the US and you live in Haiti. But this simply goes against the grain of the objective relationship that we have in the world, independent of what's in our brain. What I mean by independent of what's in your brain, you can think in a damn thing you want to, but independent of what's in your brain, they just drop some Africans off in what we now call Haiti, drop some Africans off and they now call Jamaica, drop some of us off here. We're the same damn people, and the fact that they dropped us in these different places when they kidnapped us didn't change that. The white people came there and drew those lines and borders on the continent of Africa and said, now we have this, 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 this. And that didn't change the objective reality. So independent of what's in your head, you might think that in your head you're an elephant. But the fact is that that you have all the characteristics of other non-elephants, that exist in the world. Teapot. Some people lock people up and put these special jackets on them so they can't harm themselves when they go around calling themselves by strange things that don't make any sense in the real world. We believe there is an objective reality. And when we are at our best, what we think is consistent with what is in the world. We are materialists when what we think is consistent with what's in the world. At that juncture, where what is in our brain is inconsistent with what is real in the world, we call that idealism or subjectivism. Let me give you an example. Africa can say, I'm free because I think I'm free, or I'm a Brit. We hear this all the time. No, you are an African. That's an objective truth. All you have to do to learn this objective truth is look at the objective conditions of people just like you all over the world. I don't mean people, I don't mean kind of like you. I mean people just like you. You find people just like you who are in the same general conditions and circumstances, and those conditions and circumstances have the same origin. That's why people make a mistake when they talk about reparations. They say, we need reparations in the United States because of what happened to us in slavery. But slavery is not something that happened to Negroes in America. Slavery happened to Africa. Do you understand that? In terms of nationality, our history did not begin in slavery by white people. Our history began with our relationship with our people. It's really important for us to understand that. We believe that, objectively speaking, independently from what's in our heads, whether we are fighting police violence in England or in Mississippi or Congo, every struggle that we are engaged in throughout the world is a struggle to facilitate the consolidation of the African nationality and the liberation of our continent and our people. Objectively speaking, that's what it is. Yeah. The role of a revolutionary is to help the masses come to a relationship to this objective reality so that what is in our heads is consistent with what's in the world. If what's in your head is not consistent with what's in the world, you're in trouble. You may not even know it for long periods of time, but it will get you in trouble. If you were never going to leave this room, then it might not matter if somebody thinks that this podium is a car. This person might work all the time trying to convince everybody in the room that the podium is a car. One of us might be silly enough to say, hell, we ain't going anywhere anyway, so I'll just let him say it's a car and forget about it. But I have a bigger responsibility. I have a responsibility to tell the person it's not a car, it's a podium, especially if I understand anything about the world in which we live. One thing that I know about the real world is that if African people stay here long enough, at some point, the police are going to come through that door to get us. Mm-hmm. Those of us who believe this podium is a car are going to be in real trouble. My responsibility is to help you understand the world as it really is. In terms of this question of nationality, I believe that certain aspects of what Stalin said are correct. I believe that language will be a factor in the consolidation of our nationalities. Africans talk about this all the time. They say, we speak so many languages. How are we going to unite? Nkrumah suggested that we need to create Afro-Hili, a combination of Swahili and other languages. The question of language is a real problem for us, but how does language finally get consolidated? Through common economic life. If you have a common economy, common language emerges because people talk to each other in order to produce. The problem now is that we're not producing together. We don't have a common economy. In fact, language is a product of production. people, humans as a species, had to learn to talk, had to learn to communicate in order to socially be involved in production. That's why you will find intellectuals in our communities, for example, Africans in Senegal, who speak better French than white people in France. That's because they want to be tied to the French economy. Increasingly, Africans in Africa are learning how to speak Chinese because of the penetration of Chinese capital. When we emancipate Africa and African people, we will have a common economy. If I don't speak Swahili or Lingala, I will learn a revolutionary language that will help me to emancipate Africa and African people. Then I'm on the road to unifying the language of Africa. So I believe the question of language is important. I believe the question of landmass is important in our work to take back Africa. But the problem with Stalin was that he spoke as if history were over, as if somehow when white people entered history, very late I might add, that was it. But we are here to tell them it's just started. Amilcar Cabral, the revolutionary leader from Guinea-Bissau, used to talk about how the struggle was for Africans to re-enter history, to recapture our own history. For the last 400 or 500 years, we've made history for imperialism. Now the struggle is for us to make history for ourselves. Yeah. And the struggle for nationality is a part of that. I am not a race nationalist. By that, I mean that ours is a struggle for the emancipation of Africa and African people, not for the quote unquote race as such. I really don't have much use for the concept of race. You can fight against racism all your life. Racism is nothing but the ideas in the heads of white people. Racism is the ideas that facilitate their unity with imperialism to keep us oppressed. That's all it is. And I'm not about changing white people's minds. The truth is you can be involved in a struggle to make white people like you. The poster child of that concept is Michael Jackson. But the struggle is for power over our own lives. Henry Kissinger got it right when he said that power is an aphrodisiac. If you get power, everybody learns to like you. If you want to get along with white folks, get some power and white folks will like you. Our struggle is for national liberation, for the liberation of the African nation and African people around the world. I'm reluctant to unite with this concept of people of African descent. It seems to me that you are African or you are not. Mm-hmm. I believe also that the world is not static and history has not ended. We're still in the process of making history. I believe the most fundamental component attached to this objective reality that we are talking about is consciousness in terms of national identity. Nationhood is a concept of sameness. African consciousness around the world right now has not fully developed around this question. It has been distorted and diverted. Sometimes some of us don't even like the concept of sameness. Michael Jackson mutilates himself, not because he doesn't know he's one of us, because he's ashamed of being one of us. Imperialism rewards you for being more like them than it does for being like yourself. So we learn how to please imperialism. What we have to do is to forge an understanding of what this oneness is. We identify that as African. We are African people. This oneness is the most important thing for us. It is more significant than ethnicity. It is more significant than what group you are from or the false borders that they have created. This oneness has to be overcome, has to become the thing that makes it impossible for the imperialists to manipulate us to the way it has done up to now. In the context of talking about history being dynamic rather than static, there's the question of North Africa, the Arab issue. Currently, there is an Arab consciousness, and essentially this consciousness is a form of patriotism, a unity with their own bourgeoisie. Sometimes that happens when a whole people unites against an external force and that threatens them. Europe has been threatening the Arabs from the time of the Crusades until now. Sometimes being Arab translates to having an Islamic consciousness. The Arab masses have the same problem that we've got. There's no place in the African world where we are not dominated by some reactionary sellout neo-colonialist petty bourgeois force that works with imperialism. Whether it's Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Thabo Mbeki, Nelson Mandela, Jesse Jackal, or any number of other forces. We all have that problem. In 1963, at the founding of the Organization of African Unity, this is spelled wrong, Kenneth Kaunda, it's spelled Kuanda. Kenneth Kaunda from Zambia said the first thing we ought to do is create an all-African bank. That's the petty bourgeoisie's interest in banks. Yeah. Ahmed Ben Bella, fresh out of Algeria, where the Algerians were struggling against French colonialism, stood up and responded, no, what we need is an all-African blood bank, because we need to march on South Africa and destroy that regime. That was an indication of the consciousness that existed at the time. Who was taking the best stand then? Kaunda, who was phenotypically sub-Saharan black, or Ben Bella? I say Ben Bella took a better stand, and I have no problem with that. I think we would be better off if we had marched off with Ben Bella. It would have helped to have consolidated the Arabs of North Africa into an African consciousness. Everybody in Africa is going to have to fight for African liberation and black power. Right now, we have that nonsense in Occupy Tanzania with the white people calling themselves Africans. That is nonsensical garbage. The white people are the colonizers. Some comrades and I were in Belgium in a museum. A white woman overheard us talking and rushed up to me saying, "You're not African." I had never seen this person in my life. She said, "What language do you speak?" "I'm an African from Congo. I speak Lingala," she said. "You're not an African, I am an African." That's what the white woman told me, but it doesn't work like that. You don't assume any identity like that. She wouldn't want to be an African if Lumumba had succeeded. By the time this is over, a lot of people are going to want to be Africans. I believe that Michael Jackson is going to try to find his lips. I hope he, how do you say that word? Cryogenically froze his lips someplace so he can rescue them when African people come to power. What we're involved in is a process for the struggle of African nationality. To the extent that our struggles are successful, it also undermines what we now know as European nations. All right, comrades. So we have some times now for discussion, and I look forward to it. And I do hope that, again, I hope that people will read this again. And I think this is the critical question of our times, and we'll find more discussion and more developed presentation around this question of the nation in the book Izwe to the Africa. So let's move it forward.
We want to do another roll call. So if you've already stated your name earlier, you don't need to say it anymore. But if you came on during the presentation, during the study, please state your name, please.
Or if you have not heard your name called.
We'll call the names, and if your name is not called, please state your name. Uhuru.
Uhuru. We start with Mike Love, Talithia, Usainu.
Please mute.
Usainu, Will, Lisa, Ruby, Ali, Ona.
All right, just mute. We're just doing, all right, just mute 1 second. If you don't hear your name, then you come on and you let us know.
Now you got it. I'll make sure to ask him. So ask me questions.
Go ahead, please.
This is Taylor.
All right, hold on 1 second. 1 second. We're about to call the names.
Okay, let me start over. It's Mike Love, Talithia, Usainu, Will, Lisa, Ruby, Ali, Ona, Star, Rio, Daphne, Tammy, Robert, Javon, Brenda, Erdosia, Gazi, Chairman, Gaida, Kabaka, Fofi, Chimarenga, Livia.
All right, if you haven't heard your name, please state it now. Let's kind of do it, give each person a second after you hear somebody else's, just to start letting us know your name. Uhuru. If you haven't heard your name, please state it now.
Taylor.
Who is that?
Could you repeat? K-Fan.
Next.
Who? Repeat.
Sean.
Next.
Oro, John.
Thank you, John. Next.
That's it?
John.
Is this the same John or another John?
Sean.
Sean.
I have Sean, I have John. Who's after Sean and John? Comrades, we have to expedite this so we can get to questions. So I know there are more people because I was making strokes as we went along. So after John, is there anybody else? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty slots.
This is Day.
Day?
Day. Deidre.
Okay, I got you.
Are you guys on mute?
It's all right. Let's go ahead and get with the questions, please. Well, you spend some time dealing with the study.
Okay, we're open for questions at this point.
For who, Chairman?
Uhuru.
I have a question from Periscope, the screen name is Motown, and they were asking, how do you feel about the xenophobia in Azania, or AKA South Africa?
Yeah, that's exactly part of what we're talking about. This whole concept, because what's being spoken of is.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, what are my thoughts about the xenophobia that's existing in Azania or occupied Azania or South Africa? And what we've seen there is in the recent period, something that we've seen in other parts of Africa, where Africans who are from Zimbabwe who have been living in Azania, sometimes working in Azania, sometimes setting up shops in Azania, have come under attack by Africans who live on the other side of that artificial enforced border that they call South Africa. And it has been championed by a certain sector of the petty bourgeoisie in South Africa. People have been killed, their properties destroyed, and things like that. And this artificial contradiction exacerbated. And what it is a sector of the African petty bourgeoisie is covering up its own criminality and its own collaboration with imperialism by attacking other African working and just African people. For example, when's the last time you heard in South Africa of mobs of African people rising up against the white corporations or the white bosses or the white farmers and people who control the real foreigners there, or even the African petty bourgeoisie? They haven't even identified the role of the African petty bourgeoisie that's been ripping off billions of dollars. I mean, you got a so-called guy who was a trade union leader before the end of apartheid, who is now a billionaire sitting on major corporations in South Africa. That's the foreigner. That's the one that has no loyalty to Africa, and none of them are under assault. So that's why we say that the nationality, the question of the African nation nationality, has to be primary, and that there are going to be different ethnic groups for a long period of time. They will disappear in significance with history, and because even when you look at the different ethnic groups, they got consolidated from families and other groups who came together. They produced collectively. They created what it took for us to live. They actually controlled land and stuff together as ethnic groups, to the extent that the economy is open up and there is one single economy throughout Africa. You will see ethnicity, though it may still exist, it won't have the same pronounced kind of significance as it does today. And that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, of course, is the fact that in South Africa, we're looking at a situation where the borders, the artificial borders, are the defining factor in terms of who is an African, who is a South African. We've seen that in other places. We've seen that in Ivory Coast, where people are not able to run for office or vote and do other kinds of things and are killed. etc., because they come from across the border that was artificially created by white people and white power together. So it's a false concept, and the African working class, the African revolution, is going to have to identify who the real foreigners are, and the real foreigners are those corporations, are those white people who continue to steal from Africa within each of the borders that's been created by white power. Uhuru. Anybody else?
Uhuru, I'm getting a lot of questions online about what book we're reading from, and it's One Africa, One Nation. One Africa, One Nation. I'm getting that from YouTube and Periscope. Another question was from Mawuli, and his question was, how exactly will we get reparations?
Through revolution. Reparations, from the perspective of our party, we've been doing reparation work for a long time. In fact, we played the primary role in making reparations. In fact, it was our determination to make reparations a household word. And a lot of people see reparations coming through legal arguments and debates and parliaments and United Nations, etc. And for us, that the debates and the United Nations and the parliaments, etc., can be useful, but they're only useful as political tools to raise the consciousness of African people, because reparations is achieved with revolution. When you succeed in taking power, then you take reparations, you make reparations real. Now, what's going to happen is we will see, as the crisis of imperialism deepens and more African people get involved in the struggle, you're going to see white people volunteering to pay reparations in order to stave off the revolution. You understand? Yeah. So they would try to, in fact, we have a reparations component to our work. And there are white people who are involved in the reparations work on an ongoing basis, and they actually struggled to win reparations, and they are going to be, part of their task in the upcoming period is going to be approaching corporations and rich white people and everybody else to give them an opportunity to get on board for a new world, because we're coming for what belongs to us.
Before Chairman, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this study, and I think that this study is extremely important, especially now during this time. You know, the new year is coming, and Black people need to know that they're African, and it's something that, you know, I'm challenged with every day online and meeting people. Is just, even when I say, you know, this is an African community or African problem, and I can't even get to the summation because I have to fight for their identity and let them know that they're African. And it didn't dawn on me till, you know, this is embarrassing, but last week when we had a Sunday study and you were talking about, you know, unifying into Africa, and, you know, even though I'm staying in and understanding I'm African, I had to look at my hands and say, these are African hands, and really understand the concept of, you know, being African and just how much they really, you know, going through this have separated us. So I really unite with this, and gives me the tools to go out there and talk to my people and get them to understanding that they're African and understanding what one nation is. And so many people get so boggled, and, you know, when you say Africa, you know, Africa's 54 countries and 2,000 languages and and they go into this thing of separation and idolizing separation, idolizing, you know, loving that, you know, we are our differences, and ignoring the things that make us sane, ignoring the things that are going to get us to revolution and freedom. And this is just great, and thank you.
Uhuru. Let me just say this, that the whole idea about reluctance to be African right now is, we see that from time to time, but the fact is that the success of the African Revolution will make more and more African people want to be African. And it is the fact that Africa, in everybody's mind, is associated with poverty, despair, ignorance, violence, and all these horrible things that makes it unappealing for Black people to want to be associated with it. I remember in the 1960s, at the height of the revolutionary movement that was happening, and it was really blazing across the continent of Africa. I remember knowing this young brother at one time when he was with the Black Panther Party. He called himself Lumumba. His name was Lumumba. But with the defeat of the Black Revolution, he joined the Young Lords Party, which was a Puerto Rican party, and his name was Che. So when the revolution is strong, you will see all kinds of people like Ben Bella, like Nasser from Egypt. You know, everybody could associate it with Africa when Africa appeared to be on the verge of success. It's nobody voluntarily wants to be a part of a failure. What we have to do is introduce people to a reality that Africa is rising now, and that Africa, the success of all Black people and humanity, in fact, is going to be tied to the success of the African Revolution. Uhuru. Anybody else?
Hello, Chairman.
Uhuru.
This is Day.
Yes, Dave.
I just wanted to appreciate this study as well as teaching me a lot every Sunday. I also have a question about the identity of being African American. And I know that it's just one of the words that were used to describe African people in the United States over the years. First was Negro, and changed all these different things, and now it's African American. But I was taught that it came into being as a way of kind of unifying Africans in America with Africans in Africa, or with Africa itself. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, because at some juncture, this is particularly true with the advent of the OAU. We saw more Africans who were willing to define themselves in relationship to a particular colonial territory. In 1963, that was the OAU, when Nkrumah lost the first round in the struggle for uniting Africa. You got to remember that when Garvey built the revolutionary movement, he didn't say Africa for Africans, those at home, and the African Americans and the Afro Brits and all of the other stuff. It was one Africa because we had Africa speaking with one voice. And what has happened with the defeat of the Garvey movement, and then subsequent to that, the defeat of Nkrumah's efforts, the significance then went back to the question of identifying ourselves with a particular territory. In the United States, some of it was a sort of a self-defense for a while, that we didn't want to recognize ourselves as white or Americans right up. So some people use the term Afro-Americans. Even Malcolm X talked about the organization of Afro-Americans, if you remember. But that too was tied to the existence of the organization of African unity. What we saw, though, that made the African Americans the thing that people refer to themselves now, it was in response to a growing identification of Africans in this country in particular with Africa. That Africans started buying medallions, making medallions with just Africa, and were wearing the Africa. That's all you could hear coming from African people in the 1960s. Then, in the late 60s, then what happened was Jesse Jackson, the woman who was head of I forgot the Negro, some kind of Negro Women's Association, I think the Urban League, and a whole group of other people had a meeting. They literally had a meeting, and they came out of the meeting and announced that henceforth Black people in this country would be characterized as African Americans. This was a political decision, and it played the same role in this country that the OAU played in undermining Nkrumah's effort to make one Africa. Now, these Negroes saw us heading toward one Africa, Jesse Jackson at the head of it, and kicked off this thing that we will all be now known as African Americans. And then overnight, all the newspaper articles, everything that you saw began to refer to Africans in this country as African Americans. So it is not some natural kind of phenomenon, but it was a political decision that was made by people who saw the obliteration of that hyphen being something that threatened their careers as a class, as a social force. Uhuru. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Uhuru.
Yeah. Uhuru, Africa.
Yes, Africa.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the analysis again. Always informative. I just wanted to, raise the issue of science. African people we've been convinced that science is alien to us and all that rubbish. But then there's an African saying, and Cabral had made mention of it in his book, that no matter how hot your well water is, they will never cook your rice. And earlier you were talking about how if you put water on the stove, the conditions that boil the water, we don't pay too much attention to that science. And I think it was very timely and important that we embrace science, because we have been dealing with science way before Europeans. And I think in our analysis, we have to really put it forward in there, because there's no way well water can boil your rice, because that was so scientific. That statement is, and it has been said maybe thousands of years by Africans. So I just think that the importance of science, for us to understand the world and ourselves, is very primary. Thank you for the analysis.
And I want everybody to really, grapple with that question, because what I'm struggling against is all the spookism that's out there that poses as being involved in the revolution, where people have melanin dipsticks, where they check and see how much melanin they got this morning, or other kinds of silliness about just weird stuff that has no relationship to explaining the relations of forces in the world, the relations of power in the world. What is it that gives rise to society? What is it that society is organized around? What is it that makes African society so different? And it is different and has been different. In fact, we have to rescue African society because it's under assault, African culture under assault. But it is not because of some Ron Karenga-like Kwanzaa stuff that was a creation by somebody. If culture is also a response. Stems from the whole process that human beings are engaged in to create life. That's what culture comes from. You don't go into a closet and say, okay, this is our culture now. I thought up, I had a dream, some stuff like that. It's a part of the process to create life that people develop culture, and it is something that is born from the actual process of that occurring. So I just think it's really important, for us, to come to terms with there is a science of society, and we have to really learn how to master that science. Uhuru. Yeah.
Cool, Chairman. This is Javon. I just want to really appreciate the study, just in the fact of the relationship of the economics to the nation. And the language, and it's an economic basis for everything coming from the nation, that the nation is built on. And I just, and you can see why you explained, you broke it down very well, why we're not a nation, because of the fact of the Europeans coming in and dispersing us across the world, and also using us to build their resources, their life, and their nationhood. So, I really wanted to really appreciate that. That was, the fact that the economics is really the driving force. The fact that we can't make money or produce life with each other. So the language is we're not able to carry on the languages. We're not able to carry on the cultures and stuff like that of our own. So, I just wanted to appreciate.
Well, let me just say that it's not that we're not a nation. It's a dispersed nation that demands consolidation. Because what happens is when you're dispersed like this, you don't even know your relationship to your brothers and sisters. There are practices and habits that you have right here that have their origin in Africa going back a millennia. But you don't even know it. You just know stuff you do here. And then you go someplace else and you find that, like I said, I lived all my life. I lived in my 60s here in the United States. I'd never gone to the continent of Africa. And it's upon going to Africa for the first time in my life, I did not feel like a stranger. And it's more than just language, because I was in places where I didn't speak the language. But everything that people did was kind of way we do stuff. You understand? It was more than that. It's a really deep and profound thing. And you can't see it if you go to Africa as an American or as a tourist. But if you go there open, then you will see your grandmama and everybody who was like you. You will see everything about you in Africa. So we are African people, but we don't even know. I've heard Africans say, well, we don't even have our culture anymore, and people believe that. But you believe that because you haven't seen our culture as it reflects any place outside of Chicago, outside of your own neighborhood. But once you see the whole African world, hell, every African, more or less, and then what is also happening is more and more non-Africans are acting like Africans because they have been impacted by African culture, whether it's in the church, you know. White people don't have church the way Jimmy Swaggart and all these other people started having church. It was Africans who took Christianity and did something with it the way Africans do stuff, and then now it becomes something all the Southern religious people do it all the time. It ain't their stuff. And you know, white people, you know how white people go to church. You know how white people, and when you see them doing something, it's because of the impact of Africa. Now you don't even recognize that it's yours anymore because it's been so messed over and distorted, etc. Uhuru. Anybody else quickly? We're going to expedite this because I think announcements and stuff like that have to be. Uhuru. Who is it?
Uhuru. I'm real quick. This is Herdosha.
Yes, Herdosha.
Chairman, I just really appreciate a PE, and I just wanted to make 2 comments. I just really appreciate the whole science question because I came from a place, you know, just coming from Christmas, and it's like the first one that I didn't celebrate, but it didn't move me because I understand science now, and I think that I just unite with that we are taught, and science is so demonized because they understand that if we really deal with the science, then that's going to make you outraged to want to do something about your situation. So if you live in a dream world where, you know, you can't do anything about the oppression that you're facing, then you continue to pray, fast, and wait for somebody to come and, you know, take you out of it. But if you deal with the science and understand to deal with the world just as it is, you understand where you should direct your anger towards, not each other. That's why we see horizontal violence, families don't get along because we oppress people. And we direct that anger towards the wrong people because we don't understand science. So I just really appreciate that in a real way. And I just wanted to say that, you know, the whole thing with, you know, my ex-husband is from Ghana. And I never felt like I understood who I was until I understood his culture because he was from the continent. So I, you know, at the time I didn't understand, but when I was around, I seen so much of my family and his family. It was just amazing to me how, like you said, you know, Africans, you connect with all Africans wherever you are. You see the same, you see yourself. And I see myself in that culture, and I always felt like it was something missing out because, you know, I felt like we had moral culture from America. But when I was around his family, I seen so much of my family and so much of just African people, no matter where you at. So I just really appreciate this. I think I just really do appreciate this. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Anyone else? Comrades?
Uhuru, we have Yeshiela
from
YouTube, and she said, Uhuru Chairman, can you sum up the struggle in Ethiopia? It's being presented as an attack against Oromo people.
Yeah, there's, again, we're looking at the ethnic contradiction. There's a serious war going on in Ethiopia right now. The African petty bourgeoisie leadership there, and that doesn't even get to the essence of it. I mean, that whole question in that region, but particularly in Ethiopia, where part of how power is acquired has been through organizations and military forces revolving around ethnicity, different ethnic groups. Amharic is the dominant ethnic group in Ethiopia. And then there are other peoples who are there who experience domination by this ruling group. When we say ruling group, in this instance, we're talking about the petty bourgeoisie. And then sometimes there are different petty bourgeois forces, Eritrea, different groups in Ethiopia who are contending with each other for domination and what have you. And they don't define these struggles based on class interests and stuff like that. They define them based on ethnicity, and they're able to recruit huge sectors of ethnic groups to fight in the interest of a petty bourgeois force in the name of defending or fighting one ethnic group versus another ethnic group, and it's the petty bourgeoisie that's really contending with each other. So that's Ethiopia, but it's all over Africa. Ethiopia, the same thing, Eritrea, the contradiction between what is called Eritrea and Ethiopia, part of the same kind of thing with different petty bourgeois forces, sometimes who actually led armies and struggles to come to power, now contending with each other in ways that almost reflect madness and what have you. It's the reason why we say the national question, African nationality, has to be the primary defining thing about us as a people. Uhuru. Yes, come
One thing I want to say, I really want to unite with everybody that spoke about the significance of this study. And I think the thing that, for me, that made me appreciate it even more is the whole question of us, really coming up with our own understanding, using the science to come up with our own understanding, because we saw science as it was interjected into this discussion through Marxism, and African internationalism wasn't on the scene. Until African internationalism came on the scene, we were able to define ourselves, our place in history. We were left out, even under science, we were left out. And in African internationalism, just brought the whole thing in, and placed us in our rightful place. And I just really appreciate, because I think for a long time, they've used this whole question of the division to really conquer us. And I think it's under African internationalism emerging on the scene, defining for ourselves, and now we're taking command of our own history and the forward trajectory towards revolution. So I say kudos, I really appreciate this.
I want to say that just because something is scientific doesn't mean it's correct. It can be scientific and wrong, but the point is that it can be falsified if it's wrong. That's the thing that really arms us, and so we have to struggle for science. And I just think that's really important for us to understand. Some people are turned off by science because they say, well, that's wrong. It didn't happen that way. Yeah, it doesn't make it non-scientific. It just makes it wrong. It's, even though, and one way it's wrong is because you've seen the evidence. It means it was falsified. Nobody still proved to you yet that in the beginning there was the Word and the Word was God. Nobody has proved that to you. Uhuru. Anybody else? Yes. So, comrades, anybody want to, before we, yes, comrade, guys, Yehuda.
I didn't want to ask this question, but it seems to be coming up in different ways. People asking about, what about the Moors that helped, what's his name, Hannibal? The one that cut off the hands.
The Moors that helped.
Yeah, they said
Leopold.
Yeah, and then they would say, what about the Ashanti tribe that helped with the slave trade, like all these things of Africans helping white power, white imperialism. They're like, what about that? What about that?
I don't know. They weren't holding elections back then, so we can't blame it on Obama. But he is evidence of the same kind of thing that we're talking about. And, I think that's also important. It's a really important question, because just because we say we're Africans doesn't mean that we're smart. It doesn't mean that all of us have integrity or anything like that. It just means we're Africans. And I think that's really important for us to understand. And the other thing that's really important to understand is that the attack on Africa by Europe assaulted us on two critical levels. One, on the belief system, the assault on the belief system of Africa. That's one of the things that made Christianity and even Islam significant, to undermine the belief system in Africa. And the other thing is that the assault on the economy in Africa, so that all the African people became economically dependent on this external force. And so if people were going to get resources to live with, they found themselves ending up having to sell their brothers. And I've seen that happen in this country, where when the white people introduced crack cocaine into our communities, and then overnight I've seen young African women turned into prostitutes in order to feed their husbands and their boyfriends and their own habits and things like that. So we had an external force that intervened in Africa, that assaulted the economy of Africa. And then now that if you're going to get something to eat or feed your family and stuff like that, people end up participating, capturing other Africans, so that that they would be able to get some resources and hoping they wouldn't be captured themselves under the same circumstances. So it's a common thing. They did the indigenous peoples in this country the same way. They couldn't have even defeated the one of the ways certainly that made it easier for them to defeat the so-called Indians was the Indian scouts, who they turned into white people. There used to be a group of people, literally true, of indigenous people whose last name was White Man Runs 'Em. And so there was like Mary White Man Runs 'Em and John White Man Runs 'Em, and their last name was that because it was what it was, because white man had them doing everything they did. And so that's an attack, assault on the belief system, and people now find themselves making a living by collaborating with the oppressors, and that happens in our lives all over the world. So I want to thank everybody. I think that there's a question of announcements and stuff like that that have to be made, and I'm trying to make it happen in a fashion that allows us to end the study at the appropriate time. Uhuru.
Oh, is related.
Africa.
Uhuru, everyone. This
Africa.
Yes, Uhuru.
Oh.
Uhuru, everyone. This is Gazi Kodzo calling from the National Office of Recruitment and Membership. I have some quick announcements to make. First announcement is the plenary is coming very, very soon, January 9th and 10th. So register now. Register now. Tickets are selling very, very fast. We already sold out of t-shirts, but have a new bundle of t-shirts coming. So put your orders for t-shirts as well and make sure to register. Also, if for some reason you're unable to make it, please email the contact that is at apspplenary.org. apspplenary.org. It's an acronym for African People's Socialist Party, apspplenary.org. Make sure to register. If you cannot, make sure to bookmark apspplenary.org because we will be live streaming the event worldwide. So make sure to register now. The next announcement is our radio. Black Power 96.3 is coming soon. We have these amazing boxes for the, our banks. We have amazing banks for the to raise money for $96 for 96 days. Everybody has some change in their pockets, in their cars, in their pocketbooks, in their shoes. You take that little piece of change and you put it in this little boom box. It's so cute, and we will ship it to you. Just go to blackpower96.org, blackpower96.org, and put your order in. It's a keep a change program. So wherever you have change, just put it in there every day and it will come up to $96 or more, and send that in. We have an amazing opportunity because we have an angel donor, you guys, an angel donor who will be matching whatever we raise. So if you are able to give 96, this angel donor will match your $96. And we know $96 is hard to get for one day, so we ask you to do it with 96 days. So $1 a day, $1 a day will get us a Black community radio station, something that is for us and by us as African internationalists. We're tired of hearing about the lies on the news. We're tired of hearing about the lies in our newspapers and our radio stations. So we got to build our own, y'all. So this is why this is very, very, very important. It is a must to have in our revolution to be able to communicate with each other and take over media, take over the airwaves. So it's going to be Black Power 96.3. It will be worldwide. We will have an app, but we need your support. Black Power 96. Don't you love that name? Black Power in the name. We ain't afraid, y'all. Next, our next announcement is, I see all the comments and all the questions about what is Chairman reading from? What is Chairman reading from? It is the book, One Africa, One Nation. One Africa, One Nation. And we also have the newspaper, the Burning Spear newspaper. We also read from An Uneasy Equilibrium, and you can get all those things at burningspearmarketplace.com. burningspearmarketplace.com. I'll say it one more time, burningspearmarketplace.com. Buy the books and newspaper there. I do know the books and stuff are on Amazon and all that, but you know they take a percentage. You don't want the white man to take a percentage. So make sure to get it at burningspearmarketplace.com and make sure that all those resources go back into the African community for African people. And you can read One Africa, One Nation. I'm currently reading it right now, and it's an amazing book. So order that, y'all. Order that. We can talk more about it later. Next thing is, if you haven't gotten enough of this amazing African internationalism and political education, and you also want some tunes and a preview of what Black Power 96 is going to sound like, Africa Live is going to be live at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can go to ahurunews.com, and click on the radio link for Uhuru News Radio, and you can listen to Africa Live at 11 a.m. and continue your political education. The last announcement I have to make, as always, is a call for membership. If you are listening and this is your first time listening, or you haven't signed up to join the African People's Socialist Party, if you agree of all the things Chairman was saying about unifying African people under African nationalism, you need to sign up right now at join, joinapsp.org. Join African People's Socialist Party.org. Join apsp.org. And also, one more thing is to sign the petition, Africans Charge Genocide. Africans Charge Genocide. If you are tired of hearing about the murders and everything that's going on, please sign the petition, africanschargegenocide.org, at africanschargegenocide.org. We have a goal of 1 million signatures. Make sure to sign it and share it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We have political education every Sunday at 8 a.m. Make sure to also check us out on Uhuru TV, Uhuru News TV, Uhuru TV on YouTube, where you can check the whole live stream if you came in late or anything like that. We have it fully recorded and ready for you. All right, you guys. Uhuru, One Nation, One Africa.
Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Mhm.